what I did to my ex-husband sometimes. In the middle of nowhere, you meet people that teach you what it means to trust. With Nicholas, it was the exact opposite. After he dealt with me, I haven't been able to fully trust anyone else. I met Nicholas at a party I'd been forced to attend, but I wasn't feeling it. I was slouched on a chair in the corner with my cup of booze in my hands. My friends had tried to get me on the dance floor, but I'd violently refused. I glanced down at my watch, hoping the shorthand of the clock would finally strike 12 so I could leave. No such luck. Time was unbearably slow. It was barely 9:30. Suddenly, someone slid into the chair beside me, and that someone was flashing me a smile that could have been termed charming, but in the state I couldn't help finding it irritating. I sighed and looked in the opposite direction. I didn't want a conversation. "Hey there," the guy said. I turned over to give him a warning look and noticed that the said stranger was still grinning wildly at me. What on earth could he possibly be so happy about? Or maybe he'd had too much to drink. I shook my head and pretended to be absorbed by the memes on my TikTok page. Maybe if he got bored of trying to talk to me, he'd move on to something else. I was wrong. He sidled closer to me and whispered, "I thought you'd want some company." Surprisingly, I didn't smell any alcohol on his breath. I sighed again, but decided to reply to him this time. "And what could have given you that notion?" "I don't know," he muttered. "Maybe it's the fact that you've been sitting here since you arrived at the party, or the bored look on your face, or the fact that that's your 5th cup in less than 2 hours." I couldn't help laughing. How had he noticed all that in such a crowded room? "Have you been watching me?" I asked. He shrugged. I tried. "But it'd be hard to take my eyes off the prettiest girl in the room. Plus, you look a bit sad." He looked me in the eyes, "Want to talk about it?" And that was how I found myself spilling all the tea about how I wasn't in a good place emotionally, and none of my friends understood that, and how I was going through a rough patch at work, and I was really worried about my dad's health, all to a complete stranger. It felt so good to finally let my feelings out to someone who couldn't judge me, and he turned out to be a great listener. I didn't even realize it was way past 12 till one of my friends, Janice, came to drag me home. He asked for my number, and that was when I realized we hadn't even introduced ourselves. "Nicholas," he'd said. "Nicholas Spielman." Over the next few months, we talked a lot over the social media. He constantly checked up on me, sent me random gifts to cheer me up, and even surprised me with date nights. He was so sweet and gentle and caring. He even followed me to some of my therapy sessions. We eventually couldn't go a day without hearing from the other person. We obviously started to date. And it got so serious that before we knew what was up, we'd started prepping for our wedding. I never met my mom. She left when I was really little, and my dad did more than he should have to try to fill the shoes of both parents, so the loss wouldn't be too great for me. He gave me the best education possible, showered me with gifts, got me the latest phones, and so much more. The wedding wasn't any different. My dad was extremely excited when he heard the news about the wedding. He immediately gave both of us his blessing and promised to foot every bill concerning the wedding. He's extremely rich, including Nicholas' suit. When Nicholas didn't turn down my dad's offer or think twice when billing my dad for his clothes, I started to have some reservations. It just felt weird that he didn't offer to be responsible for the costs of his wedding. But the gut feeling went as suddenly as it came. Everyone liked gifts. Some people just knew how to hide it better than others. The wedding day came, and it was blissful. Everything was gorgeous and perfect. The food was exquisite. All my family and best friends were present. And my dress, I just loved it. I felt like a fairy tale princess, and my Prince Charming looked as handsome as ever in his tuxedo. Towards the end of the event, my dad announced that as a final wedding gift to us, he was going to pay off our mortgage for our new home. Again, Nicholas accepted without hesitation. He didn't even act overly grateful. I was scared that he was starting to feel entitled and would expect handouts from my dad whenever it was convenient. Being married to Nicholas wasn't bad at all. He was as sweet as I'd known him, though there were fewer gifts and date nights. He sometimes made Saturday brunch all by himself. He was an excellent cook, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I looked forward to his meals because I secretly thought they tasted better than mine. As all couples do, we had our little spats here and there, but there was nothing too serious. Soon, we started having kids. Our first child was a delightful baby boy, Ben. He was so perfect and he looked exactly like his dad. Next, we had a gorgeous girl, Rose, who still happened to look more like her dad than she did me. We both loved them dearly, but things started to get strained between Nicholas and I. We both had reasonable salaries, but with the new mouths to feed and bodies to clothe, we could only save a tiny percentage for ourselves, and Nicholas wasn't into that. He was always trying to find cheaper alternatives for their supplements and cereals, or wanted me to get all their clothes from thrift stores, and just couldn't get over the fact that their wipes and baby soap got exhausted so quickly. He didn't like to spend so much of his money on the family and expected me to pay a higher percentage of the bills if I insisted on spoiling the kids. Obviously, this led to a series of intolerable fights. We were constantly mad at each other and started to pick holes in things that shouldn't really have mattered. At some point, I started sleeping in the kids' room. I couldn't stand to sleep beside someone so self-centered. For a while, I'd been trying to secure admission to a prestigious postgraduate school in India for my master's in law without telling anyone. The whole process had been complicated and disappointing, so I didn't want to raise anyone's hope just to get them dashed. Fortunately, I'd gotten a positive response. There was finally an open slot for me, which I had to claim as soon as possible, or it would be offered to someone else. I quickly forwarded the mail to my dad, and bless his heart, he promptly paid the fees and bought me a plane ticket so I could travel the next week. Before I knew it, I was already on campus, starting a rigorous academic journey. I was so excited. I loved the environment. Everyone had this laid-back, friendly vibe. There was so much academic competition, and the food was quite really exotic and spicy. I was having the time of my life, but I missed my babies. I'd left them with Nicholas, and I wasn't sure how well he'd be able to take care of them. I Skyped with them every evening after classes and asked my dad to keep an eye on them. Apparently, distance does make the heart grow fonder, because Nicholas himself started to FaceTime me to ask how I was and how the classes were going. We were getting back into a rhythm without all the external pressure, and I began to miss them all terribly. I'd see a random child and remember how cute Ben looked when he falls asleep while eating, or I'd see a couple in the park, and my heart would start to ache. I was yearning to hold my family once again, to be with all of them. I wanted to braid Rose's hair, play games with Ben, go shopping with both of them, scold them for having too much candy, and taste Nicholas's delicious meals again. I was getting so terribly homesick. I couldn't even enjoy the bright and colorful Indian festivals that were being held. I couldn't eat any of the exciting-looking Indian foods or drinks. I couldn't even concentrate in class. I wanted to be with my family, and one day, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my father and poured out my feelings to him while tears rushed out of my eyes. Seeing how horrible I felt, my dad decided to send my family to stay with me in India for 3 years, till I was done with postgraduate school. My dear father figured that the kids would have to go to school, and they'd need to rent an apartment while they'd be here. So he budgeted about $2 million for their flight expenses, school fees, and a few months' rent, so they'd get settled in quite easily. We told Nicholas about the development, and he seemed quite happy to join me. He claimed to have missed me more than I could ever imagine, and wouldn't mind moving to a totally different country to be with me. Their flight was scheduled to leave at the end of the month to give them enough time to pack and prepare. My dad, as trusting as he is, gave his debit card to Nicholas and asked him to transfer the $2 million to himself. Normally, my dad wouldn't have been as careless as that, but Nicholas was considered family, so there was nothing to be skeptical about. Nicholas decided that he'd sort out the money the next day, so while the kids were in school, he headed out to the bank. The school had long been over for the kids, but Nicholas was yet to arrive. The teachers waited and waited till they could wait no more. They dialed his number repeatedly, but they got no reply. Finally, they called my dad, who came to pick them up almost 6 hours after school had been over. My dad called and told me what was going on, and we all tried to reach Nicholas. I started to panic because I was scared that something terrible had happened to him that was preventing him from coming back home. Little did I know that he had done something unimaginable. Late in the night, while my dad's butler was going through the children's bags to ensure they'd completed their homework properly, he found a letter from Nicholas. His letter was addressed to me. I'm so sorry for leaving like this, and I hope you'd all find a place in your hearts to forgive me. To our kids, Ben and Rose, I love them both so dearly, and I know they'd grow to be marvelous people. I know this doesn't seem like the right thing to do as a husband, but I want to forget all about me. I want you to move on and be happy. I care deeply about you, but I'm not cut out for marriage and responsibilities. I hope your dad doesn't get too pissed at me. The only reason I'd make off with the money is because I need it and I know he can spare it. Please don't look for me. I wish you the best in life, Nicholas. How immature and foolish could someone sound in so few words? He was comfortable leaving his children without a glance back. He said he wasn't ready for marriage and responsibilities, and he's almost in his mid-30s. So when was he going to be ready? When he was in his 70s and he really wanted to steal my dad's money. After my dad read the letter, he rushed to freeze his accounts. But he was too late. Nicholas had already transferred $5 million to his account, $3 million more than he was authorized to collect in the first place. For such a foolish person, he had a lot of brain power when it came to scamming people because before they could even track down his account, he'd scattered the money in bits into various accounts and investments that were untraceable. My dad didn't want to involve the police because he worried about how it would affect the children when they grew up and realized that their father was a criminal. We hired a personal detective to try to get some information on his whereabouts. At first, it seemed like he'd walked off the planet. Eventually, we found that he'd moved to a different state and was only leaving his girlfriend's apartment at night. Yes, he had a girlfriend. I was speechless. The fact that he could do all that to his own family after making vows on the altar was appalling. I didn't care much that he'd moved on. What stung was that he'd left his own children without a father, and he was having fun with my father's hard-earned money because he could spare it. I was even more distracted at school than I was before. What was I going to tell the kids when they asked about their father? What if he suddenly came back and decided he wanted to take them away from me? What if he realized that he misses them and kidnapped them at school one of these days? I was getting more and more paranoid, and my mind was starting to fill with anxiety. I had to write to the Dean of Student Affairs and ask to be allowed to go home for some time because of the peculiar circumstances. Thankfully, she understood my plight and granted me an exit for a few months. My mind felt calmer, and I felt more at ease being around my children. I felt like the only way I could be sure that no one would harm them was when I was there in person to protect them. But as if Nicholas wanted to emphasize my fears, he actually went to visit the children at school one Tuesday. And they told me a daddy came to see us, and he said he hadn't been able to come earlier because you hadn't allowed him. My blood ran cold. I didn't want him around them, and most especially, I didn't want him feeding them lies. I had to do something about him, something that he deserved for all the rubbish he'd done to us, and something that would make him stay far away from us for the rest of our lives. I knew that I couldn't do anything that would be carried in the tabloids because it would eventually affect my children. I had to do something low-key, but extremely painful. There was one thing he loved with all his heart, and that was money. I was going to use that against him. I had to hire the services of a private detective to pose as the CEO of a successful investment company and forge account statements with my dad's bank records since they contained large amounts of money. I was spending a lot of money on this plot to get back at him, but it was absolutely worth it. All he had to do was fall for the words of the detective and invest all of his money. As expected, he swallowed the bait. He obviously couldn't resist the possibility of doubling the money he'd stolen in such little time and with no extra effort. All he had to do was deposit his money into the account we'd created for him. Once his deposit was confirmed, I froze our joint account, the only other source of funds he had. I wanted to be sure he had no other option to get money. Then we transferred our money, which he'd spent almost a quarter of, back to its rightful owner. Sooner than later, he realized that he'd been swindled. Just like he'd swindled me. I could imagine his panic rising as he was frantically dialing the number the detective had given him, but no one answered the phone. I'm sure he must have even visited the address on the flyer we'd handed him and would have been surprised to find no such company there.